By the summer of 1914, every major European power had developed detailed plans for war. With the exception of Britain, continental nations relied on universal conscription, requiring most young men to serve in the military and creating massive standing armies that were theoretically ready for combat. The greatest challenge, however, was mobilization, the complicated process of calling up reservists, distributing weapons and supplies, and transporting troops to the front. Mobilization schedules were slow, rigid, and highly complex, leaving little room for adjustment once they began. As a result, European leaders came to believe that the nation that mobilized first would gain a decisive advantage and likely win the war. This conviction transformed the July crisis of 1914 into a dangerous race against time, pushing Europe closer to a continent-wide conflict. Russia understood that its industrial economy was less developed than those of its European rivals, and that mobilizing its enormous army would require weeks to complete. Fearing that it might be caught unprepared if war broke out, Russian leaders began mobilization as soon as tensions escalated during the July crisis. Their goal was to ensure that Russian forces would be ready for combat before their enemies could gain a decisive advantage. However, Russia's rapid mobilization deeply alarmed Germany. German leaders viewed the move not as a defensive precaution, but as a clear step toward war, increasing their sense of urgency and pushing Europe closer to a general conflict. Germany now faced what its leaders considered the worst possible strategic situation: a two-front war against Russia in the east and France in the west. To prevent being trapped between two powerful enemies, Germany put into action its long-prepared military strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan. The plan called for Germany to concentrate the majority of its forces against France and deliver a swift, decisive attack that would knock France out of the war before it could fully mobilize. Because France's eastern border was protected by strong fortifications, German planners intended to bypass these defenses by invading neutral Belgium and then sweeping into northern France toward Paris. Once France had been defeated, Germany would use its extensive railroad network to transfer its armies eastward and confront Russia, whose slower mobilization process was expected to delay its readiness for battle. The entire strategy depended on speed. German leaders believed they had only a narrow window of opportunity, and even a small delay could cause the plan to fail and leave Germany fighting a prolonged and costly war on two fronts. Germany assumed that Belgium, a small, neutral country with a relatively weak military, would not resist German troops moving through its territory. German leaders expected Belgian authorities to allow safe passage, enabling the German army to carry out the Schlieffen Plan and quickly advance toward Paris. They miscalculated. Belgium firmly rejected Germany's demands, insisting on its neutrality and independence. In response, Germany invaded on August 4, 1914, violating Belgian neutrality. Rather than surrendering, Belgian forces mounted a determined resistance, fighting far more effectively than German planners had anticipated. Although Belgium could not stop the invasion, its defense slowed the German advance and disrupted the carefully timed Schlieffen Plan. The delay created serious military problems for Germany, but it also sparked a major diplomatic crisis that would soon draw additional nations into the war. Germany hoped that Britain would remain neutral if war broke out. British leaders had traditionally avoided becoming deeply involved in conflicts on the European continent, and Britain had no formal treaty requiring it to defend Belgium militarily. However, two important factors made British intervention increasingly likely. First, Britain and France had developed much closer relations through the Entente Cordiale of 1904, fostering greater diplomatic and military cooperation between the two countries. Second, Germany's invasion of Belgium shocked British policymakers. For decades, Britain had viewed Belgian independence and neutrality as vital to maintaining the balance of power in Europe and preventing any single nation from dominating the continent. Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality was therefore seen as an act of aggression that threatened both international agreements and British strategic interests. As a result, on August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Within just 6 weeks of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the Balkans, a regional crisis had escalated into a general European war, drawing the continent's major powers into the first conflict on such a scale since the Napoleonic era. One major European power remained neutral when war erupted in 1914: Italy. Although Italy was a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, Italian leaders felt excluded and offended during the July crisis because their allies had failed to consult them before taking major actions. Italy also argued that the Triple Alliance was a defensive agreement designed to protect its members if they were attacked. Since Austria-Hungary had initiated hostilities against Serbia, Italian leaders maintained that they were under no obligation to enter the war on Austria-Hungary's behalf. As a result, Italy declared its neutrality in 1914 and remained outside the conflict during its first year. However, Italy's position would later change. After negotiations with both sides and promises of territorial gains from the Allies, Italy abandoned the Triple Alliance and entered the war against Austria-Hungary and Germany in 1915, joining the Allied powers. The final tragedy of 1914 was that, once the major powers activated their war plans, the process became extremely difficult to stop. Military mobilization schedules were rigid, railroad timetables dictated the movement of troops and supplies, and strategic plans left little room for delay or negotiation. Military leaders feared that any hesitation could place their nation at a fatal disadvantage and lead to defeat. The German Schlieffen Plan was especially significant in making war seem inevitable. Under the plan, if Russia mobilized its forces, Germany would immediately attack France before turning east to face Russia. To reach France quickly, German forces would invade neutral Belgium, and Britain had pledged to defend Belgian neutrality. As a result, Germany's attack on France automatically drew Britain into the conflict. Consequently, France, which had played only a limited role in the July crisis, found itself at war largely because Germany's military strategy required an invasion of French territory. Once the first step was taken, every other step followed automatically.